Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us. As you can imagine, we had hoped to do this in person, but it's no surprise that we're here virtually given where things are with COVID-19. So thank you all for joining us this morning. I do want to make one small correction just to Josh's comments. We had a little bit of a technical difficulties this morning, so we will not be joined by Tom Schoening, but the rest of our panelists are with us and will be speaking to you shortly. So without further ado, let us present the Developers Toolkit. The MEREDA Developers Toolkit is really the brainchild of the Local Issues Committee, which you just heard Josh introduce a little bit. The Local Issues Committee works on matters of interest to MEREDA members at the local level in a number of our localities and municipalities around the state. As a premier work product, the toolkit is something MEREDA would typically provide only to its members. During these challenging economic times, however, MEREDA is pleased to offer the toolkit to anyone who is interested in developing. And we'll share more at the end about how to get your copy today. So while Josh has introduced our panelists, I do want to say the Developers Toolkit is a great start for developers of all sizes. But as we'll hear from our panelists as we go through it this morning, development is complex. And given all of that complexity and the different needs of MEREDA members and the different sizes of their projects, the toolkit was designed to be a modular document. And it's broken down into chapters, which will enable the developer to quickly find the help they need for their project size and scope, which takes us to the chapter list. So the Developers Toolkit is 7 chapters, 5 of which are really substantive, and chapters 6 and 7 are templates and the sample project. As we go through, you will see examples that we've taken from the templates and the sample project. The sample project that we are using today is a small project that we fictionalized in a town called Practice Pond, and it's a small brewery that a couple would like to build on some land. And you can see here, this is sort of the overview of the sample, so that as you're going through the toolkit, you have sort of a project in mind, even if you don't have a project that you know you're going to work on yet. So let's start with chapter 1, which is project scoping. Chapter 1 covers project scoping and the pre-application phase of development. In the modern world of development, it's important to make sure your project is the right size and fit for the community, both literally and figuratively. Putting together a comprehensive project description at the outset is important, and it will help you consider the bigger picture and where your project fits in the community. Take time to put together a mission statement, which I know may sound strange or not something that you're used to doing as part of development, but it is really important, and it will help frame your project and create the kind of elevator pitch that can really help sell it to the community. So for example, in our sample case, the couple, as I mentioned, is looking to convert the brewery looking to convert an old rundown property, which was a rail site, into a bustling brewery. And it's in a mid-sized lake town. And their mission statement is as follows. Rail Ale will bring together the best of Maine at Practice Pond, trails and ales. Using local, sustainable ingredients to brew exceptional beer, Rail Ale will be a premier townville gathering place, drawing both local and regional visitors to Practice Pond. So as you can kind of hear from that mission statement, it's more than just this project will be a brewery. It sort of takes that bigger picture community impact into account. And then the other elements of a project description include the location, the physical description, an estimate of the timeline for the project so that the community knows how long construction will be going on. And if possible, think about putting those elements into a one-page handout similar to what is represented here on the right, that is something that can be handed out to local community members and interested parties as you move through the development process. And I just want to say that project scoping is a phase that can be easily overlooked or diminished as you think about the other bigger pieces of your project. But the work that you put in now really will pay off in spades. And I think you will see that as we move through the application process and the communications piece as well. So I'd like to turn now to our panelists. And I'd like to start off with Rick Light. Rick, can you tell us a little bit about what you think are some of the most important steps an interested developer can take at this early stage of the process?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Elizabeth. My background, I'm a civil engineer, is in the engineering and planning component of the project. And I think there's some key things I think that relate to all projects, regardless of the size. And really, I think that number one, as you said, Elizabeth, was getting together with a client and formulating a team, but understanding the client's goals, both financially, economically, and characteristically. What is the outcome expected by the client? I think it's really important to have a clear, concise project description for the public, but also for the project team, and knowing where your client's coming from, what the client's background is, what's the purpose of the project. And that's sort of the cornerstone, I think, to really communicating all the way down to the project team as well as to the public. I think something else that forming a project team is important, determining who best be on your team, what disciplines you need. Do you need an architect, a landscape architect, engineers, complex projects, and they all seem to be complex today. Geotechnical engineers, surveyors, wetland scientists, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, does the client understand that all these disciplines are going to be needed at some point, likely in the project? And sort of building that team, the framework of the team up front is critical, I think, to a project scope. And then I think there's a kind of a desire these days, I think, for people just to jump into a project and start designing. And I think that's a mistake. The due diligence phase, in my mind, in my experience, the due diligence phase and the concept planning phases of a project are the most critical for any project, especially if you want it to be anywhere near successful. Starting with the review of your zoning. Are you in a growth area? Is this project compatible with the zoning? And if not, is it going to require a rezone? Does the town have a growth area? Is it consistent with a comprehensive plan? Even if the zoning permits it, is it really consistent with a comprehensive plan? If it's going to be a controversial project, you really ought to know that up front, because that's sort of the foundation of the acceptance of your project within the community. And just dealing with the site features, understanding the site, the utilities, soils, again, wetlands and vernal pool analysis, critical. We all know that you can't identify a vernal pool completely until the spring season, but having a walkthrough, if you've got a project where a vernal pool shows up 6 months after you've started your design process, you could be in a heap of trouble. So basically understanding the site, understanding the utilities, understanding the zoning, understanding the neighborhood, and reaching out to the neighbors. What does the community think of this project? I think those all together are really the foundation of a team and a project. And the last step is really jumping into design too early is a mistake. I think start with the concept planning, basically trace paper, start simple, get everyone's ideas on the table and formulate the concept that everyone has input on, and making sure you're meeting the client's goals. Maybe at this point, the site doesn't work for the client. It's not big enough. It has too many issues, and it's time to walk away without having invested a whole ton of money. So I think those starting small, foundation steps, building blocks, those are all critical. And then that really defines the project scope as you go forward. And that's from my experience anyway.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rick.
I'm wondering if one of you might be able to talk a little bit about your experiences working with different engineering, design, attorneys, professionals. Right at the beginning, there was a slide in the presentation, as I'm sure you saw, that sort of speaks to the importance of working with professionals and experts in the field, even as you set out to learn to develop on your own. Ethan, I was wondering, can you tell us a little bit about what you think about the role of your team as you get started on these projects?
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, everybody. I think I'm stealing this from Nathan Zanton, who said this 15 years ago at a public meeting, and I internalized it, and it's been true every day since, that the most important thing we do as a developer, the most critical decision we make in the whole process, is the team we assemble. And every project is different. And I think people often make the mistake of saying, well, architect X is a friend of mine and did great on the last project, so let's use them again. Or that engineer is someone who I like, and so let's go with them. But the team needs to be very carefully crafted to make sure that it's uniquely qualified to do the particular type of project, whatever the particular use is, or whatever the particular challenges your project may have, whether they're environmental or political or illegal. And you need to find the team that is best qualified to handle those particular unique aspects of your project. Moreover, I think what's critically important when we're talking about the permitting process and the public review process is a team that understands that locality. Another mistake I see people making is trying to take their A team and transplant them into a community where they've never worked before. And what we know is that although city codes are technocratic and very logical, the process is in fact quite political and can be quite unpredictable. And you've got personalities on municipal staffs, you've got personalities in neighborhoods, you've got personalities on planning boards, and you need to have technicians who understand how to navigate those waters. So team selection is critical, and I think people need to sort of detach themselves emotionally from their team and think of it very practically, because it is the most important decision in the process.
Thank you, Ethan. That was very helpful. I think that's a very good point about the development process being so political these days. I think you'll hear that thread as we continue to go through the toolkit this morning. Gary, would you talk to us a little bit about sort of from your perspective as an attorney, what it's like when you have someone come in for the first time, they've got an idea. What do you sort of encourage them to do in these initial steps with regard to scoping their project?
Sure. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm often one of the early people involved. Sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not, actually. But when we do get involved early, I mean, first of all, really understanding the lay of the land. So that can be the zoning, the political environment. Also, I really like to understand and try to map out the regulatory approvals that we need to obtain, and drilling down right into the various elements that we're going to need to establish. So let's say you're putting up an apartment building or a commercial building, and we need to look at the particular site plan ordinance in the town and determine exactly what the criteria are that we're going to need to establish. And that may help us do things like, choose some of the team. Do we need to have a traffic engineer? Are we, what is not only what is required in terms of the ordinance, but also, are there traffic issues in the locality that people are going to be concerned about? And when you're dealing with something like that, often there is one hot button issue that a project has to overcome, and you want to focus on that early, right up front, and try to really, get your arms around that so that you can address those concerns and really try to design to address them. And probably it might be bringing in a traffic engineer very early in the project and starting to work with them and to talk with them. One of the other things that I really like to do and encourage is to have an early sit down with the planners in the municipality that we're going to bring the project in. Usually they're very receptive, to hear from us. It's informal. It's really not, I don't want to say it's officially, it's non-public. Of course, anything you do with a public official is is public from sort of a legal standpoint. But, you know, this is the opportunity to ask the questions that you might not even want to ask during a public meeting. You know, what are the hot button issues that I should be thinking about? Who are the important you know, constituents that I need to be talking to? And the officials will, you know, can be very, very helpful. Let you know what are their concerns they have, you know, with getting this project approved. And you can have an open and very useful dialogue about the project. And it also can be the kind of thing that, you know, sometimes we have clients who just think it's just going to be very easy. They think their project is the best thing in the world and that everyone is going to love it. And of course, we all know that that's not necessarily the case. So it can be helpful, you know, to have them. I always want to have typically want to have my client attend those meetings, you know, those pre-application meetings, and have them hear, you know, about the concerns and the issues and the things that need to be addressed.
That's great. That is good feedback. Yes, thank you so much. So that actually, Gary teed us up very nicely. I didn't even set him up to do this, but he teed us up very nicely for the next section of the toolkit, which is chapters 2 and 3. So let's turn to chapters 2 and 3. Hopefully you can all see it there. In 1 second. All right. There we are. Okay. So chapters 2 and 3, you can see that we've divided it into sort of the basic local approval process, but also the advanced local approval process. And we did that so that it gets scalable to your project, the size of your project and your needs. We are going to take them together here this morning just as we go through. But, you know, if you have a small project and you don't think you're going to need to worry about things like comprehensive plans, then you could, you know, maybe just pick up chapter 2 and familiarize yourself with that. But maybe you want to know a little bit more, and then you would go to chapter 3. So the biggest takeaway from this chapter this morning, and also hopefully when you begin to review the toolkit, should be that you need to research and understand your local approval process. Every municipality is a little bit different and every project will be unique. So you will need to spend some time understanding what the steps in the approval process will be and break it out so that you know what to do every step of the way. That said, and as you can see here, we've laid out the high-level process for the municipal land use approval. This is a place where you might find our template helpful. As I mentioned before, we have a templates chapter, but I've given you an example here, as you can see on the right, of what our template looks like to help you navigate where do I look for the information that I need to understand my local approval process. But also, and going to our next slide, as you begin to do your preliminary research and understand what is required in your community to get your project started. Gary mentioned this, and I think it's important to highlight that the community, the decision makers in your community can also be very helpful in helping you understand, both what you have to do in terms of the checklist, nuts and bolts application items, but also give you some of those insights into, what are the hot button issues in this community? What opposition might you run into? Gary said sometimes everyone thinks their project is the greatest thing ever, and there's a lot of truth to that. But meeting with municipal decision makers early might help you understand aspects of the project that you haven't thought of, particularly potential negative impacts. So some of the folks who are particularly important to get to familiarize yourself with: the planning board, of course, although I'll just mention that they are the sort of ultimate determiners of many permits, and there is a prohibition on speaking to members of a planning board once the application process is underway. Prior to that, though, you're welcome to talk to them. Code enforcement officer, I cannot say this enough, the CEO, as they are often known, is a critical component of this whole process. They're oftentimes your only one-on-one connection to sort of the approval outside of the public process of going through the planning board. So that's sort of the basic overview of the local approval process from a high level. But as I mentioned, we did also get into advanced local approval process in the toolkit. There are actually quite a number of tools related to this advanced process. I won't go through them all here this morning because it would just take too long, but I do want to highlight a few things. So one is the applicable strategic and comprehensive plans. I think Rick Light touched on this, but some municipalities may have plans in place already that sort of guide their development as a town, as a city, help provide guidance to their decision makers about, this is a part of town we want to work on. Maybe, we want to work on housing. This part of town, we want to work on jobs and construction. We want this to be the industrial part of town. Those are applicable to some towns, not to others, but something you definitely want to be aware of. So we have included information on it in the toolkit. Additionally, you want to familiarize yourself with the positive and negative community impacts of your project. This is what we were talking about in sort of saying, there are undoubtedly many great positive outcomes from your project, but understanding the potential negative outcomes is critical to being able to get ahead of them. And then finally, to the extent you have negative impacts, they tend to be, and I think you heard our panelists mention this, environmental or transportation related. And understanding how you might be able to mitigate the negative impacts early can help you as you move forward with actually submitting your application and going through the local approval process. So you can see on the right, those are examples of what we've covered in the toolkit with respect to the advanced local approval process. And before I turn back to our panelists, I just want to say a word about mitigating and the sample case in the toolkit, because I think it's particularly helpful. The sample, which I did not put up here, but which is in the toolkit, does a nice job of providing an example where our sample developers, right, they're going to build their brewery, they're building it on an old rail yard, and they are going to have to do some wetland fill, because there's just this sort of, little wetland kind of off to the side near a maintenance shed where the train used to come in and out. And at first blush, that sounds terrible. No one wants to fill a wetland, and certainly most community leaders don't want to approve filling a wetland. But as you'll see from our example, our developers decided, that at the end they could invest a little bit, put in some superior drainage, and actually clean up the sort of falling down building and come out with a better environmental impact, actually improved environmental standard for the area than what they started with. So that's just an example of where the toolkit samples and templates can come together to help you as you move through the content. So that said, the local approval process is always a very personal process, and I think you heard our panelists speak to that a little bit, but I'd like to hear more from them about their experiences with the local approval process. And I'd like to start with Gary. Gary said something the other day that I thought was funny, and I'd like him to expound upon it. He said, as the attorney, he wants to really be the person in the back of the room when you're there and you're talking to the planning board or you're talking to municipal decision makers. And I think that was very well said, because you want to put your project foot forward. So Gary, tell us a little bit about your experience working clients through this approval process.
Sure. Well, specifically with the comment that you're talking about, what I'm really talking about at that point is when, who appears on behalf of the project at the public hearings, whether that, any public hearing, whether that's a workshop hearing or whether that's the actual public hearing where you're going to get input from the client. And typically, I think it's best to have your designers, your architects and your engineers, and the owner, actually present the project. Usually, people don't necessarily want to hear from the lawyer for the project, and it may, if you have a project that's controversial, it may put, some of the neighbors or opponents sort of on the defensive to have the attorney be the primary project spokesperson. So, in a really well thought out and presented public process for the approval, I like to make sure that it's really the designers that can show off the project, talk about all of the elements. I mean, and that's really their forte, to talk about the project and the design. And in a perfect world, I may be sitting in the back, available to address a opposition or legal issue or something that might come up. But if we go through the process well, you may never even have to hear from me. Now, on the other hand, there may be projects that do have some sort of legal issues that, in which the lawyer may need to speak about a particular issue. So an example might be, there's an easement, and the easement has particular language or limitations on it, and maybe I get up and I speak about those particular issues and how and why we feel that this works for it and it doesn't present a legal issue. Or sometimes you may have to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals to get a conditional use before you go and get your site plan approval. So at the Zoning Board of Appeals, it's more of kind of a legal quasi-judicial process, and that might be appropriate to be run, by the legal team as opposed to the design team. But that's, I think, and again, it all kind of goes back to choosing those right professionals who can speak to the community and to speak to the planners. One more thing that I do want to mention is ultimately, we have to get the approval of the planning board or the zoning board of appeals. But initially, you also kind of need to get the approval of the staff, because they're going to be writing up a staff report for this project in most communities. And ultimately, you want them to be advocates for the project. So you need to sell the project to them, in all your meetings with them. And also, you need to sell the project to the neighborhood. And you ultimately, if you can get the neighbors to either not oppose the project or ideally even to come in and say how much they like the project, those are really good things to happen.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'd like to ask Ethan, what would you say is sort of, give me a top or a couple of top things that you learned as you started to become familiar with local approval processes that you think you should be on the lookout for? What are some things that people might not think to look for, and they know they're going to have to take out an application, but what are some of the sort of really important parts of the process that you have to be on the lookout for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And before I was a developer, I was a planner, and so I've literally watched hundreds, I might say thousands, of projects go before planning boards and HP boards and zoning boards of appeals, and it's been interesting to see the misses that are very common. So that's a great question. I think people often come in with a very good technical plan, maybe even a good communications plan, but haven't really figured out the lay of the land in terms of who their audience is and what parameters those folks might be looking at. You have to look at this process through everyone else's lens as well in order to be prepared for what might come your way. And so one of the things I've noticed is people just they get kind of blindsided by the community resistance that might be there, or the a staff opinion that might come out in a report. And so I think it's already been touched on here, but it's worth just repeating that it's this due diligence process of getting, as Gary put it earlier, understanding the lay of the land is critically important. And that means meeting with staff early, as Gary said, but it also means kind of getting a sense of these boards you might be in front of. What I like to do if I'm going to a new community in particular, most of these boards are broadcast publicly. You can watch them on the internet. And I like to just go watch the last two board meetings from before when I'm going to be there, just to understand the personalities and the considerations and the dynamics of the room. And you can learn so much and be so much better prepared. Likewise, you need to kind of get a sense of who's who the stakeholders are, who the impacted parties in the community might be. You don't want to show up at one of these meetings where, you know, you're forced to stand at a podium and there's no interaction with the people in the room. You can almost sometimes fall into these unexpected arguments between you and people sitting behind you from the audience who had their 3 minutes at the podium to speak. And suddenly you're in this conflict you didn't know you're going to have. So not everybody likes to do this, but I'm a big fan of preemptive neighborhood meetings. A lot of cities and towns require neighborhood meetings. They'll say, like, for example, have your workshop with the planning board, then go have your neighborhood meeting, then come back for a public hearing. I like to go to the neighborhood before the workshop to not get into that situation. And there's a great example I was just reading in the Press Herald today, and I'm going to mention Nathan Zanton for a second time, which is random, but it was mentioned that the city of Portland just awarded the Douglas Street project to a particular team. And one of the things that that team did that the other team didn't do is they had these preemptive neighborhood meetings. They went out and talked to abutters, and they used that sort of beating of the bushes, if you will, to understand the butters' considerations and to get ahead of them in their design. I think that's really important also to do. I see people get blindsided a lot. They think they've got their ducks in a row and they haven't. So that due diligence process of understanding the staff, the boards you're going to be in front of, the neighbors that might come out, and the community at large is really critical. And I see people miss that quite a lot.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great example. Thank you. I couldn't have come up with a better example. That's so fantastic. Rick, we just have a couple of minutes, but I was wondering, since you are someone who obviously does end up speaking, being the spokesperson, as Gary was saying, up in front of the town, what's sort of a tip that you can give people, something that you think about when you go into these meetings, that's a goal that you have outside of just do well and get the project approved?
Oh, thanks, Elizabeth. I think one of the things to do is start by taking off your engineer's hat if you're an engineer, and talk to the people, talk normal, talk common, and talk about it. I like to talk about projects as communities. Don't tend to use the word subdivision if I don't have to, but use the word community, and it sort of brings in the idea that you're trying to create something that's for the community. But going back to something Ethan said, so important is not only understanding the boards by looking back or having experience, but sometimes I'll actually go and look at individual members. What's their background? What do they do for a living? Who's the attorney on the board? And another thing, a tip that I would do in front of a board, and to what Ethan said and Gary both, the preemptive meeting with neighbors early on is so important in town staff. But I'll go and when I'm looking at the site, what's the context of the site? I'll actually go and mark up a plan with, yellow house across the street, number 271 is Mrs. Smith. So, and the red house next door. So when these people come up in a meeting and you've never met them before, they weren't at your earlier neighborhood meeting, you can say, oh, you're Mrs. Smith in the red house with the 2-car garage. I know exactly. And that visual line from this, our driveway, we'll move our driveway over so we're not going to affect your, headlight pollution into your front lawn. Just that personal level, I think that's critical. Anytime you can get personal with the community and with the neighbors, I think you buy points. Yeah.
That's great. Fantastic tip. That was a pro tip. And actually, once again, they've teed me up without my having to ask them to. Rick was just talking about the sort of most important part, I think, of the developer's toolkit, which is the communications piece. And that's sort of where the rubber hits the road between what you've done with your project scoping and everything we've talked about this morning and the local approval process. So let's turn to chapters 4 and 5 of the toolkit, and we'll go through communications. 1 second, I just gotta bring it up. Okay. So again, you'll see we've divided the toolkit communications piece into 2 chapters, chapter 4 communications and chapter 5 advanced communications. The reason I said that in some ways this is the most important part of the toolkit, and I think our panelists have very much touched on this, it's a piece that I think most people who are interested in development, maybe their background is in real estate or their background is in construction, or maybe their background, as is the case in our sample case, isn't in any of these things. But what is often missed is the advocacy for the project. It's not enough in the modern world of development just to check the boxes in the application. There is a whole other layer of building support for your project in the community and amongst the stakeholders that really is critical to development process. So if you take away nothing else from today, I hope that you'll all consider the communications piece as you move forward with your project development. So let's go through it quickly. When you are building out your project scoping in the beginning, as we discussed, you may have heard me say that it's a little bit of work to put in on the front end, but it pays off in spades on the back end. And this is the payoff. This is putting together your talking points and key messages. So what do we mean by that? These are the messages that you're going to want to share with community leaders and stakeholders as you go out and start to try to build up support for your project. So taking the project handout that we put together early on can be helpful to sort of reframe your thoughts around how you want your messages to be. Share compelling facts about your project. Be sure to include the positive community impacts. And then this is the piece where, probably the hardest piece, respectful counterpoints to opponents' arguments. And that's, I think, we kind of gave a great example of the woman, across the street with her garage and the light pollution. An opponent argument might be that this, is going to just impact their quality of life in a negative way. But if you can respectfully counter that by showing how there will be positive community impacts, you can often mitigate a lot of the opposition right away. And then also just your project completion time frame. As we mentioned earlier, the community will want to know, how long the project is going to take to complete and what disruption they may go through. And so again, here we've provided samples and templates for you. I think in this case, the samples and talking point template is going to be very helpful. If you're not used to advocacy and you're not used to building talking points, it can be easy to get bogged down in the details of your project. So I encourage you, if you're not familiar with it, to look at chapters 4 and 5 and to sort of understand how keywords and key thoughts can really punch out your argument. So then, of course, you want to go and take your messages into the field and actually talk to people. And we've covered most of these here this morning, but I'll just give you a few examples of local project stakeholders. So you've got, other local businesses, your local community chambers of commerce, economic development organizations, maybe regionally, maybe statewide, other industry associations. So in our sample case, maybe the Maine Brewers Association might support them. And then those folks, once you've sort of identified them, you might categorize these ones I've just named as likely proponents for the project. Tend to be a pretty business-friendly group of people there. But you're also going to identify potential opponents to the project. And those could include abutting landowners, local activists, environmental organizations. Again, you'll have a better sense of that as you start to understand how your project might impact positively or negatively your community. And then you want to take your messages and your list of people that you want to share your messages with, and you want to actually go share your messages. So holding those meetings is really important. And you can do it at the neighborhood level, as our panelists mentioned, have a neighborhood meeting. You can also have one-on-one meetings. So, for example, in this case, one of the proponents we would hope for our sample would be the Pond Region Chamber of Commerce. So Rail Ale would want to set up a meeting with the Pond Region Chamber of Commerce. And the message for the meeting would be to take advantage, that Rail Ale will take advantage of the best practices in the industry and continue to grow and bring new jobs to Maine. You want to have a goal for the meeting so that your message resonates. So your goal in this case would be, we want to do all these things, we're going to do all these great things, but we need you to be there to support us. And in the same vein, on the opponent side, maybe the Friends of Practice Pond or the abutting landowners aren't supportive of the project, But if you share with them that it's going to have minimal negative impacts and actually have some improved environmental impacts, and maybe you're doing some other things to mitigate the negative side effects. And then the meeting goal there would be to either get their support, which is unlikely, but to get them to just not take a position one way or the other, to stand down in the sort of public sphere. So as Gary mentioned, you'll go through your actual presentation to municipal decision makers, typically at a workshop, maybe at a public hearing, some combination of both. This is where all of the work that you've done up until now through the toolkit really comes together, and you can put your best foot forward and be the big public presentation for your project. And here we've just shared a little bit with you our sort of template and also the toolkit tool around how best to build that presentation and make it in such a way that you gain support. And then advanced communications gets into a lot more, and so I won't again go through the advanced piece here, but we go through quite a bit of detail on information sessions, which you heard our panelists discuss, and sort of more information about how to do those. Maybe your project is big enough that you think you need a media plan. Maybe you think you're going to get a lot of press, either negative or positive, and it would be good to just kind of have a plan in place for how to deal with that. And then finally, thanking your supporters, updating the community. These are things that with a larger project, you may want to consider doing, and we can help you think about what you want to do. So that's the advanced communications piece, and that, again, was chapter 5. And believe it or not, that takes us through the substantive chapters of the toolkit. And before I turn back to our panelists to close us out on discussion, I'd like to share with you how you can get your copy of the developer's toolkit. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is normally the kind of thing that MEREDA would only offer to members who have a membership. But because of the difficult times that everyone is facing right now, we want to do our part to help Maine development. And so we are offering the developer's toolkit for free. We would ask that you visit our website at mereda.org and just register your name to download the toolkit. It will be available today and as soon as the presentation is over. So, turning back to our panelists, I'd like to start off with Ethan. You shared a little bit about your experience with communications, but you've just recently done a lot sort of in the public sphere on this, and I'm just curious if there's anything you think every person should know before they go in and meet with a mixed group of stakeholders, opponents and proponents. Sort of what that looks like and what they should be prepared for.
I think can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is just to have a plan. I think a lot of developers, again, like looking at the process in the past, you see folks come in and they're very technically prepared and they know their project very well, but they haven't really come up with a communications plan. And so just like when you're releasing any product, it's really important to have that and to spend the time and to invest into thinking through how you're going to communicate your project. And that can be beneficial not only in the permitting process, but for most of us, these early communication plans that we put in place become potentially the beginning of a marketing plan, whether it's a residential project or retail or something that you might end up wanting to lease or sell. This is like the world's first introduction to your project. And so it's really critical, not only just from the permitting, but from the standpoint of the whole life cycle of the project. And within that plan, I think it's really important to be very thorough and think of which way everything could go, but also understand that nothing's going to go according to plan. I always think of the analogy of the birthing plan. Those who have had children and been through this birth plan process, you put every delicate detail on it, and it never goes that way. And you need to know that going in, that you have to stay loose and limber, and anything can happen. So within that plan, I think it's really important to think specifically about first and foremost the messaging. And you've already mentioned here that it's really important to have your messages really well thought out, really well scripted, and to stick to those scripts. I think I see a lot of developers get in front of boards, in front of community members, start shooting from the hip. And it's really important to kind of stick to your messaging really well. It's really important to control visuals as well. Another mistake I see folks make is they'll come into a community process with a really fully baked drawing at the workshop level. I mean, they've already designed every corbel and figured out every color scheme, and it presents the impression on the community that this is a done deal. You've already figured out what you're going to do, and you're not really there to listen. And so I think it's really important to keep your sights on where you are in the process and refine your level of detail appropriately. I also think it's really important when it comes to visual materials. Another mistake I've seen made a lot is people will leave one of those fully baked plans. Maybe they have one, and maybe they think that's where they want to go, but it's really important to control the visuals you release to the community, because very often something like an early draft you had of something can get in the hands of the media, and next thing you know, that same picture is coming up over and over. That you've moved on, you've gone to something else, but that earlier image that just doesn't reflect what you're doing just keeps coming back. So you have to be. I always keep the PDFs and the drawings and everything very, very carefully managed from that perspective. It's also really important, and you touched on this, Elizabeth, but no matter how big or small your project is, no matter how rural or urban you are, there's going to be some degree of media attention, whether it's the local paper or the Boston Globe. You're going to get some attention on this. And it's really important to control your media messaging, again, your imagery, your scripting, and so forth, and be prepared for that. And if you don't have any experience working with media, you should maybe go on YouTube and teach yourself, or bring someone onto the team, because it's the media will grab onto aspects of a story that you don't think are important, but that's what they're going to hear, and that's what we're going to do. So you have to really be deliberate about what you say and how you say it. And yeah, that's the main idea. Where it's really being deliberate about going into how you're going to communicate the project visually, verbally, and staying loose, and knowing your parameters too. I think as things change around you, you got to know, this whole thing is a negotiation effectively when you're going through a public review process. And you need to, like in any negotiation, you need to go in knowing how much you can give here or there and how flexible you are, so that when something's proposed on the fly, that, you move that door over to that side of the building, already whether or not you can agree to that, or, how flexible you can be. So, yeah, it's going in with a plan.
Those are good insights. Rick Light, I'm wondering if you can give us maybe an example of a time when a community partner has been particularly helpful or particularly hurtful, I suppose, and how those stakeholders really do impact what happens at the municipal decision-making level.
That's a good question, Elizabeth. Off the top of my head, I think there's been a number of cases. I can't think of one specific one, but the important thing is to find those into the weeds, find the people up front who are going to be proponents or opponents. And I know that we've worked on some projects. A recent one was the schoolhouse redevelopment in Falmouth with the Ocean View, and that involved the stakeholders were actually the town itself, the residents who already lived at the retirement community, which is going to be expanded, and the developer. And step one with the client, step one from Ocean View was reaching out to all the neighbors, literally all the neighbors around a half-mile block before anything was done. And the whole process was really it was a partnership between those parties, and the public really felt, I think, hopefully, like from our perspective, felt that they were engaged, they were listened to, and again, it became successful. And you got to remember that when you finish a project in the permitting process, you or somebody is going to be living at that site, whether it's a commercial space or residential space. And so you've created an image, and those people are going to have to sustain living with the neighbors. So if you've pissed off those neighbors and you didn't listen to the neighbors, you may walk away, you may be, wipe your hands of the project, but the folks that are going to live there or use that site are going to have to live in that neighborhood. And so you sort of spoiled what could have been a positive impact to the neighborhood by not treating and listening to the neighbors.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rick. And Gary, so we've only got a minute left, but I'm just going to open it up to you generally to share any thoughts you might have about the communications piece as you perceive it from sort of your end of things.
Sure, thank you. So, you ideally what you want to have is you really want to understand the neighborhood opposition in advance, which is why, having the meetings, the pre the neighborhood meetings before you're having a public hearing is so important. I mean, you don't want to be hearing from neighbors for the first time at the public hearing with, concerns that you haven't heard before. Now, there's no way of preventing that. People aren't necessarily going to show up to the meeting that you schedule. They may show up at the first time at the public hearing, but the more you can do to try to have those discussions and really understand and be responsive to them, the better. The other thing I want to mention is, in some instances, you're going to deal with unreasonable neighborhood opposition. They want it to stay the field that they've always walked their dog in, even though they don't own the property, and they think it should forever be that. And, I think you don't have to really address those concerns. The planning board members understand, what's a legitimate concern and what's a non-legitimate concern. So I tend not to spend much time, dealing with those non-legitimate ones, but the ones that are legitimate, you absolutely want to address and hopefully come up with, mitigation and ways to, make sure that the public officials who are going to approve the project feel like they're addressing all of those concerns and hopefully guiding the project to a better place than it would have been had we not taken those concerns into account.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you, our panelists. We are running up just out of time, and I want to be sure to give a minute to close us out. So thank you. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Rick, for being with us here this morning. I couldn't have asked for 3 better panelists to sort of put some thoughts around what's in the toolkit. And I hope everyone is excited to jump in and explore it in the coming days. So I just want to, in closing, just say thank you again to everyone for being with us here this morning. And we also wanted to thank all of our viewers as well as our presenters, but we wanted to also thank Norway Savings Bank, as we mentioned at the beginning, for being our morning menu breakfast series sponsor, and our co-sponsor, Pierce Atwood, where I work. Very pleased to have them as a sponsor as well. And before we go, I just want to quickly remind members that each year, MEREDA identifies and recognizes noteworthy and significant Maine commercial development projects from the previous year, typically that embody MEREDA's belief in responsible development. And we are looking for recommendations and nominations for notable projects right now. So please consider submitting a project that you know of that you think is worthy of consideration to Shelley Clark. And before we go, I just want to say a quick thank you again to all of our sponsors: Hanford Center by the Good Shepherd Food Bank, Cape Arundel Cottage Preserve by Arundel Kennebunkport Cottage Preserve, 62 Spring Street, Founders Place Campus by Bangor Savings Bank, Southgate by Avesta Housing, Station Square by Great Falls. These are, these are examples of the notable projects that have been given out in the past, and the WEX project in Portland. So if you've got examples like that of notable projects that you want to submit, send them to Shelley Clark, info@mereda.org. And again, you can go to info@mereda.org to get your copy of the toolkit this afternoon. And we hope you all enjoy spending time going through it and learning more about this process. And hopefully you've learned a few things with us this morning and with our panelists. So thank you so much to everyone, and thank you for, again, joining us virtually. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you again in person sometime soon.